George Kilpatrick Inspiration for the Nation, celebrating people we feel good about. We've got an author. I want to say a debut author, but that isn't quite true. But we're going to say debut author. Brian Pollard is the author of The Next Best Thing and Other Stories. And he's here to tell us about a book signing that he's got going on at Barnes & Noble coming up Saturday, August 16th at 2 o'clock. And Brian, so good to see you. Welcome to the program. Let's talk about what inspired you to write The Next Best Thing and Other Stories.
Well, first of all, George, thank you for having me here. What inspired me was during COVID, when we were all shut down, I had been writing stories. I've been writing short stories for a while. Mm-hmm. But I decided to start a website where I thought that like-minded authors such as myself who had works that they wanted to put out in the world but may not have had an opportunity to be published could put their works. So I started this website and invited other authors to share their short stories, but found that week after week, I was the only one putting short stories up there. Eventually, the website, I shut it down, but decided to try and make my short stories into a collection and try to get it published. So this is the version of my book, which is a collection of those short stories. Now, one other thing I want to add, and I want to give my daughter Amari Pollard credit, because if you see the cover, the poster, which is the cover of my book, is a collage of artwork that she did. Now, when we had the website, every story started with an illustration. So she made a collage of those illustrations, and that became the cover of the book.
Shout out, and it's really nice. And I know my wife says when she saw the cover of the book, it reminded her of your daughter who was athletic, doing different things in sports during the time that they were able to, when we have mutual organizations that we were involved.
We're part of.
Yes. So Brian, so you got the title, The Next Best Thing. What does that mean in the context of the stories that you tell?
Well, it actually has multiple meanings, but for that particular story, which is called The Next Best Thing, it was a reflection of my reflection of how society is nowadays, where we're always looking for the next Arthur Ashe, or we're looking for the next Michael Jordan. And we never let children or athletes just be themselves and grow into themselves. There's all this pressure that's placed upon them, do well in one event, make a name for yourself at one AAA camp or something like that. You become the next greatest thing. And a lot of pressure is put on these young athletes. And then as soon as they don't fulfill that potential that they never claimed that they have, they're quickly discarded and forgotten about. And then it's on to the next best thing. So that was the story. One of the stories is about a young tennis player who originally was anointed as being the next best thing, but did not quite make that potential that people thought he had originally. And gradually he went into the back burner. No one was thinking about him again, but he had a breakthrough and felt like maybe he could regain that potential that people thought he had. So that's where that comes from.
And your love of writing and comes from your love of reading. You were someone who read at a very early age and loved books at a very early age. But you shared with me in another conversation that because you have older siblings and they could read and you couldn't, and you were talking about the stories, you had to act them out from memory.
Right. I had to create my own stories because I didn't have stories that I could read. And this is coming from my mother, not from me. It's not a memory that I have. But she did provide me with a story that she told me I had written when I was about 5, which I found very interesting because I didn't remember writing it, but the content of the story and sort of like mystical events of life or changes of, past lives, present lives, things like that. That was part of this story that I had written that I didn't remember. And it was something that has stuck with me. And you will find in some of the stories in this collection.
Speaking of this collection, are the stories connected by any common theme, character, or particular mood?
Not really. And I think I mentioned to you before, some people will say that they write and they just write about other people. It has nothing to do with themselves, which I find very hard to believe because the only experience that we really have in life is our own experience. So anything that I write is going to have some part of me in there, either, from something someone has told me or something I have experienced or a way I may want to see myself or not see myself. All of those elements are going to be a part of the story. So the stories. So I would say that's the common theme. But other than that, most of the stories I think are just individual pieces by themselves.
So, how would you describe your process for writing short stories? You start with a character, a situation, or is it a particular feeling in the moment?
I would say all of the above. So an
Okay.
event can happen and you know, something happens and it's not in this collection, but I'm a dentist, as you know, and there was a car that was left in the parking lot overnight.
All right, pause for a second.
Um,
Pause for a second. We should say Dr. Brian Pollard is a practicing dentist for
yes,
37 years. Just so,
yes,
all right, so
yes.
let's pause and just do that honorific. All right, now go ahead, Brian.
Okay. So the car was left in the parking lot overnight, and no one came to pick up the car. So from just that event, I created a story. That didn't happen. None of it happened, but it was just a potential. Why is this car in the parking lot? What is the reason behind it? And I created a story based on that. So that is an event that led me to create a story. So some of these stories are created based on events. Other things are based on just a feeling. And then some of them, I really don't know what the inspiration is. I just felt like writing a story, sat down, started writing, and there it was.
So, who would you say has been the most influential in helping you to shape your own storytelling voice, whether it's literary, whether it's music, uh, or some other influence that helped you shape your own literary and storytelling voice?
Well, I would say that my mother is an author, and
Mhm.
she was a professor of literature. So from that aspect, I always received, inspiration at home. Someone who would foster my desire to write, someone who would encourage me to write. So from that point of view, I have my mother. I also listen to a lot of reggae music. That is just like a constant theme. I tell people that my life is lived with a reggae tune in the background because that's just how, if I'm working, I prefer to hear reggae music. If I'm cleaning the garage, there's reggae music playing. If I'm outside doing yard work, I have on headphones, there's reggae music playing. For me, that's just the background for my
Right,
life.
right, all right. So as you're talking about your influence, I got to interrupt and say, so who's on the playlist?
Well, they're everybody. There's so many people, but a lot of people associate Bob Marley with Jamaicans and reggae music. And I can be honest with you, there are very few Bob Marley songs on my playlist. Bob Marley music to me is more meditational music. Like if you sit down and you're meditating, you really want to get deep, I'll put on some Bob. But for the most part, it could be Shabba Rankin, it could be Beanie Man, it could be Freddie McGregor, Dennis Brown. Mainly I would say 80s and 90s reggae artists are the ones who I listen to most
I'm
often.
waiting to hear Burning Spear.
Burning Spear is meditation music again.
Okay, okay.
He's meditation music. So I mean, even Black Uhuru, I listen to a lot of that. Steel Pulse, Aswad. I listen to a lot of everything, but I consider Burning Spear is more meditational music.
I hear that. I hear that. So you said some, and so with those influences is how, and with your mom, were there any others that help you with your own voice?
I'm trying to think. There are various characters in my stories who, are loosely based on real people who are a part of my life, who have been a part of my life. So, yes, there's a story in the book called Chippy, which is based on a story that my wife could not even start telling before she would just burst into laughter, and just uncontrollable laughter that she couldn't finish the story. And that story is based on a story that she used to tell us. So that's an example. But yeah, there are elements of people in my life who show up in my stories.
So how do you talked about that being a funny story. How do you balance humor, heartache, pain, and hope in your writing?
Well, it just depends on what comes to me at the time. As you and I had discussed, my wife passed 2 years ago. So a lot of the things that I have written, which I have not put into stories, are just feelings that I need to get out of the whole process that she went through, that we went through as a couple, as a family. So those are writings that are personal to me, and I put them in my iPad, not on paper. I put them on my iPad. But the other stories, which were mostly written before she passed, just depends on how I'm feeling. What comes to mind, whether it's a funny story that I remember from childhood, whether it's just a feeling that I had about the particular time I'm in. And then as far as music goes, a lot of my stories, I wish I had a medium where I could read a story and there was music playing in the background, because so many of those stories, in my mind, I'm hearing a particular song while that story is being read.
So let's pause and say that when you do the audio book of this collection, you're gonna pick the story, the sound that's gonna be playing in the background, whether it's meditative or whether it's fun, whatever it is. That's what you could do, right?
I would love to do that. And I think that would be perfect, because that is the way I want my stories to be presented.
There you go. And so you talked about the fact that you talked about losing your wife, and are there stories in the book that suggest or even come close to your experience of that?
Yes, there's one story in particular that's called Dance, which I almost call it as a inspired by my wife. This is before she even got sick, before I knew she was sick, but it's a story of an older gentleman who lost his wife and what he was going through having lost her. And that story, and how they met, and the relationship that they had. So that story, when I think of that story, the person, it's my wife. That the female, that's her. That's the person who's dancing on the dance floor. It's her. So she definitely was the inspiration to that story, but at no point in time did I ever think that that story would be a reality.
And I might add, you didn't change it even after, you know, you wrote it with this idea, but then you never went back and edited it to reflect the reality of what you were going through.
No. And I think I had mentioned to you before, which was a point of contention between my mother and myself, is she felt that when you write a story, you should write it and then come back to it and look at it, because you may want to change it. Whereas I'd always said to her, when I write a story, whatever frame of mind I'm in at that point in time, that's the story that I wrote. And if I come back to it 2 years later, I'm no longer in that same frame of mind. So whatever I wrote at that point in time, I'm not going to change the content. I could edit it for grammar, spelling, whatever, but I'm not going to change the content, because that's what I was feeling at that moment, and that's what it is.
You alluded to the fact that as a man of Jamaican heritage, that it really influences your writing and your thinking, but also as part of your identity. So how do you navigate the different worlds that you occupy as a Black man, telling stories that you want to be universal?
Well, I look at it in the way that some of the stories are very universal because I've lived in America. Basically, I came up here to go to college, and other than going home on vacations and coming back, I've been here since 1981. So I've lived in both worlds. I've experienced both worlds. So even though I consider myself to be Jamaican in heritage, I'm also American because I've been here this long, and I've experienced being a Black American for longer than I've experienced being a Black Jamaican. So I think that's reflected in my story. Some of the stories have nothing to do with the Jamaican heritage. The last story, which I really like, is actually called The Dentist, which gives some props to me in my professional life, but also just as a person.
You talked about your themes are, for lack of a better word, they're diverse, okay? But do you find yourself coming back to particular ones over and over?
I can't say, not in this collection of stories. I can't say that I have. And I don't think as a general rule that I do, because I try and make the stories different. I don't want, someone to read one story and say, oh, well, this is just another version of that one.
Why don't we have you read a little bit, a couple of lines from The Dentist, for example, since that's
The dentist. Oh, the dentist. Oh, wow.
Let me hear a little something from this is Brian Pollard. The book is called The Next Best Thing and Other Stories. Debut published novel other than his own self-published novel years ago.
Well, okay, I know you asked for The Dentist, but I think this story to me is a better reflection because it bridges Jamaica and America.
You tell me what you want to read, bro.
Okay, and this story is called My Cousin. It begins, I don't like to think about how our relationship changed, how we went from being like brothers to being strangers, but deep within, I think we both knew. From a very young age, born only a month apart, we were always tight. Playmates, fight mates, but always friends. Although we were sons of brothers who looked very much alike, we didn't. Where my hair was tight and coiled and my complexion dark, he had large curly rings in his head and a very fair complexion. That was just how we were, and as kids, we never thought about it or questioned why we were who we were. However, the world looks at people differently, and as time passed, we realized how much looks played into every aspect of life. We spent the majority of our youth on the island of Jamaica. While we lived in Kingston, many weekends were spent at our grandfather's house in St. Mary. The water was cold, the mosquitoes monstrous, but those inconveniences couldn't distract us from the fun and games we had. We played hide and seek behind the banana trees, climbed for mangoes, or simply ran through the fields. As evening would fall, we would sit on the porch devouring mangoes and watching the sunset. Roger loved to see the night fall and peeny-wallies, fireflies, appeared. He loved how they blinked in the darkness and always commented on how they made him feel safe. While sucking on a juicy seed, he pointed to two who were apart from the large group. Those two are us, kindred spirits, part of the group, but separate. I just listened. My focus was on the mango. So that's just, the beginning of that story, but it goes on to tell how they were in Jamaica treated because they looked differently and how that treatment changed when they both moved to America. Because what in Jamaica, the light skin and the curly hair basically gave him what we see in America as white privilege. Because in Jamaica, that's basically the group that he fell into, that group that's elevated. Whereas coming to America, he no longer was viewed that way. And while the one cousin who was of a darker complexion had a certain experience in Jamaica, which translated to America to a sort of similar experience. So he did not get that kick in the groin when he came to America that his cousin did. And it played out in how their lives shaped out in the long run.
And the name of that story is called?
My Cousin.
My Cousin. Yes. Thank you. And I like you took me right there to your homeland and listening to that story. So that's pretty good. And so what do you hope readers take away from your stories, and what conversations do you want to spark?
What I really want for readers to take away is that all of my stories put me in a certain place, a certain frame of mind. And
Mm-hmm.
I want that my writing was able to project that to somebody else so that if they read that story, they could be like, I could feel where you were. I could feel the emotions that you were going through. And that's what I want. The conversations really just that we're people. Not everything, not every story has to be about violence or drugs or sex. That there are other things that we can focus in on and kind of just expand our minds and expand our narrative to be something bigger. And I think you and I had spoken about it, like the Cosby Show, just regular people, just regular people living regular lives, not necessarily doing crazy things all the time or getting involved in crazy schemes, just being regular people. And that's what I want people to get from this book. Stories about regular people living regular lives.
Um, it's interesting that you say that because I know part of what you wanted this series to do is to do exactly what you just said. So, if you were to give aspiring writers who have stories to tell some advice, what would you tell them? How would you tell them to begin?
What I would tell them is what I felt that I have done is as I told you, I was an avid reader growing up, but I never necessarily found reading material that was relevant to me. It was relevant to other groups and I liked it, but it wasn't relevant to me. So the stories that I wrote were stories that I would have liked to have read if I were given the opportunity. So what I would tell an aspiring writer is don't write to be famous or write to make money. Write what you know and write what you love. And hopefully by you putting it down on paper, people will get that from your writing and they will be able to feel what you want to feel. Don't try and write something to be somebody. Just be yourself.
Outside of your mom, who are some of the authors that you love?
Well, Harold Robbins, he wrote a book called Adventurers. It's like 1,000 pages. I've probably read that book 6 or 7 times, from teenager through adulthood. I just love the book. It just went from taking a young man from 6 or 7 to his passing, maybe in his 40s, but traveling from his homeland to Europe, having to integrate himself into different societies, dealing with different levels of people, dealing with his corrupt government at home. It just, to me, it mirrored so many countries and so many potential experiences. The country could have been Cuba. Was it Cuba? No, it was just a fictional country. But it could still have been somebody who grew up in Cuba and experienced the world and then came home, tried to change it.
How has storytelling shaped your own personal healing or growth journey?
I think it shaped in the sense that when I get a story in my head, I have to write it. If I don't write it down, I just won't stop thinking about it. So once I get a story in my head, I just get out my iPad or if I'm at a computer and I'll put it down on paper because if I don't, I just will keep thinking about it all day long. So for me, it's like once that story builds in my head, I need to release it.
And you, again, August 16th, 2 o'clock at the Barnes and Noble in DeWitt and we came up with the idea that this is called the Raymore and Flanagan Plaza.
Yes, yes.
We learned that that's the address.
That's what it is.
That's the address. So, what's next for Brian Pollard? Do you have another book or creative project on the horizon?
Well, I have enough short stories for another book. So the goal is I'm not into this to just be a vanity publisher to put my work out there. If enough people like my book, if my book does well enough, and and there's a demand for number two, I'm ready. And if there's not a demand for number two, it doesn't matter. I'll keep writing my stories because they're as much for me as they are for anybody else.
And we should tell people that if you go to the book signing on the 16th at 2 o'clock at the Barnes & Noble in DeWitt, there's a limited supply. So
Yes.
The
book is available. The book is available on Amazon, BarnesandNobles.com.
Right.
If you have Amazon Prime, you can get it in 2 days. If you purchase the book on Amazon, you can bring it to the book signing and I will sign it. Other than that, I do have a limited stock, which I will have at the book signing, which can be purchased through Barnes and Nobles, and I will sign. Or if you buy the book beforehand, you can bring it and I will sign it.
All right, before we go, if one of your stories was turned into a film or play, who would you want to direct or star in it? And which of your stories would you want that to happen to?
So it wouldn't be a story in this book. It would be my first novel, which is called The Vision, which my brother had said to me when he read it, this would be a good movie. And, not trying to be presumptuous, but who would I want to direct it? I would have to go with Spike Lee because I think that story has a lot of mystical aspects to it. And I think somehow Spike is able to put a different spin or a different feel on scenes just with his videography. So he would be the one I would want to direct the movie. In terms of starring roles, I think I would actually like a bunch of people who have never really aren't household names.
All right, Brian Pollard. But Brian, before we go, what advice would you give to folks who are looking to pursue their dream? You're a dentist. Obviously, you are semi-retired, but not all the way.
I would say, which my mother has always told my daughter, who is who wants to be an author, is that you have to have your job. Do your job, whatever your job is, whatever your passion is in life, because there are very few people who are going to be successful enough as an author to that be just their main source of income.
You ain't J.K. Rowling yet.
What's that?
I said, you're not J.K. Rowling yet.
Exactly. So what you need to do is have a profession and let writing be your passion that you do on the side. If it does blossom into a line of work or a source of income, that's great. But don't depend on it as your primary source of income straight off of the bat.
The Next Best Thing and Other Stories, Brian Pollard. Catch him at DeWitt, August 16th at the Barnes & Noble DeWitt, August 16th, 2 o'clock. You can order the book on Amazon, and you can also buy it from him at Barnes & Noble. Limited supply there. So bring your book to have it authored by Brian, and we wish you well, and thank you for being on the show.
George, thank you so much for having me. It's been fun. Have a good night.
Inspiration for the nation.